So really looking at the attributes of designing a successful apprenticeship program. Now, I'm not talking about apprenticeships so much in this region, I'm just talking more generally. These are the attributes that I see from my experience around the world. And as I said, I've studied apprenticeships in France and the UK. And I should just say about the UK, you know, apprenticeships in that country are exploding compared to the rest of the world. They've gone from about 420,000 to close to 1 million apprentices in 4 years. And that's pretty impressive when you see that on a slide. But when you actually start to drill into what's going on, it's actually being used by the government as a labour market mechanism. Now, there's no problem with that. Generally, there's no problem with that. But you really need to see what the outcomes are going to be. And I think that there is some potential trouble on the horizon there, because a lot of these apprenticeship programs in the UK are not being designed around businesses' skills need. So I think, you know, watch this space. In the US, I should say, apprenticeships have fallen off a cliff. Before the financial crisis or the economic downturn, there was 500,000 apprentices in the US, and that pretty much halved. There's about 80,000 out of the 250,000. There's about 80,000 apprentices involved in the armed services, and there's been a real revival of apprenticeships, particularly in the south in the US. So the southern states, there's an organisation called Apprenticeships Carolina, which is well worth looking into, and that's a fantastic business-led model involving apprenticeships, and a lot of organisations are setting up shop down in the south. Offer attractive pay and a career ladder. Now, I want to talk briefly about apprentice pay. Once again, fairly controversial what I'm about to say, so I hope it doesn't upset anybody in the room, but I've used the word pay, and I really wanted to highlight that I actually describe apprentices' pay as more a training wage. And I think that's a great way to put that across to young people, because if you start talking about pay and then you start saying, well, but if the person was doing this, then it can get really complicated, and often employers start to shy away. But I think clearly there's a minimum wage, and there's an opportunity for employers to work out how they want to pay or how they want to remunerate their apprentices and people in training programs. But I cannot put more of a focus on the idea of showing apprentices a clear career ladder. That's absolutely critical. Assign one-on-one mentor to each apprentice. My organisation, I should say, employs 600 apprentices. The majority are in Australia and work for small, medium and large businesses. And we run a program called group training. And group training is where you have an NGO or a not-for-profit who acts as the employer for that apprenticeship group, and then basically places the apprentices out in business and industry and provides a one-on-one mentor. And what that means for business is that if things don't work out with that apprentice, or your business is seasonal, you can actually hand your apprentices back, and our organisation takes care of placing them with another employer. So it keeps the employment rates up, and it most definitely gives young people opportunities to move around, because one of the reasons that 1 in 2 apprentices fail is that there's nothing wrong with the apprentice, and there's nothing wrong with the employer or the employer supervisor, but the two just don't get on. And so often a young person is told by an employer, you're no good, it's not going to work out, and that person leaves and they don't get a second chance, and they actually become a statistic. So in our group training program, we have our completion rates up in excess of the German rate. So we're sitting at about 88, 89%. So when they're company programs, like with the motor company Nissan, we've got completion rates in that program up into the 90% range. And that's because we have pre-apprentices, because the people coming into the program have already put their toe in the water. That's because we provide one-on-one mentoring, and that is because the Nissan Motor Company provides additional training to that being offered by the community college, or as we call it in Australia, technical and further education. So there's all sorts of elements that go into designing these programs. Talking of core elements, to me there's 3 things that make successful skills programs. There's people, programs, and partnerships. Now, we were talking before about the iStock photo of my father that's not. All these photos are real people. These are people that I've met on my journey, and all these people have an interest in skills, but they're all coming from a different perspective. So if we start off on the left-hand side, there's the guy kneeling down beside a NASCAR. His name's Lucas. There's a great story about Lucas in my book. And he decided to go to a community college. He wanted to be an engineer. And he decided the best and most affordable way to become an engineer was to go through an apprenticeship. And so he did that, and I'd say he'll be running that race car team. I think he's forgotten about engineering. He's seen the bright lights. He travels around the world flying business class with his NASCAR team, and he has the time of his life. If we move across, the next lady across works in a gas turbine plant in South Carolina. And she as well had ideas about going to university. And her name's Rebecca. And she had a real struggle with her parents. She knew what she wanted to do. She thought she wanted to do international business, and then decided to go down to an open day being held by the employer Siemens and down at their plant. And it really appealed to her, the style of learning. And she now gets to learn a language. Everyone in that particular plant gets to learn to speak German at work. That's a part of the culture in that organisation. She gets to travel to Germany and see what's going on with colleagues in other countries. Over on the very far right, that guy's name is John Romain, and John is an employer. He's an employer who was a very entrepreneurial, innovative guy, and he's a pilot. You can probably see he's a pilot, and his business is restoring World War II aircraft, and he has collectors all around the world. And John's story started with he was able to talk to an RAF club about a gate guardian. You know, a gate guardian, a concrete pillar. At the end of the war, the planes were basically craned up and put on top of a concrete block. And he put forward a compelling case to that club to say, I will return this aircraft to airworthiness. And the other problem, back to insurers again, is that bits kept falling off this plane 75 years later. And they were having all sorts of trouble trying to insure these old aircraft. So John basically built a replica, swapped the plane out. The club was really pleased to get the aircraft back in the air. But what John realised is that apart from getting 75-year-old plans, he definitely had an ageing workforce. I think the average age of the workers on his first project were about 64. I met people in their 80s when I went to visit John, and he set up an apprenticeship program at the aircraft restoration company. And John now has about 27 projects, last time I spoke to him, restoring World War II aircraft. He's actually, he has plans to restore a Concorde. He's bought a Concorde, and he's actually going to get a Concorde back up into the air. So this guy's got a pretty cool hangar out at Duxford. If you're ever out at Duxford, go out and check out what's going on there. But some of the crafts, I do talk about skills of the 21st century. I mean, John's skills are skills of a bygone era. He needs to teach people how to rivet in the traditional way, restoring old aircraft. The guy to the left of John is a friend of mine who I worked with actually as a chef. English guy, we cooked many years ago. And Greg then went off and worked in the community college system as a teacher until I offered him a job mentoring a group of apprentices. And people who have a skills and technical background make a great mentor. So Greg has a fantastic job. He drives around, talks to employers. He manages a caseload of about 85 apprentices in a variety of workplaces. Now the guy in the middle, I wanted to tell you a little story about this guy in the middle. We were talking before about Donald Trump. We won't hold it against him, Doug Gorenstein, but he's actually Donald Trump's personal photographer. And there's story after story about how to make Donald Trump look good in a photo. But anyway, we won't go there. He's also Jimmy Fallon's photographer more recently. I don't know what's going on there with Doug, but he takes a great headshot. And there's a story in my book about Doug and why Doug decided to, follow a skilled career path. And so here's a photographer who had never picked up a camera until he was in his mid-20s. But as part of writing a book, and particularly for the large publishers, you have to agree to doing all these crazy things. And one of them is that if I walk past a bookstore, I have to go in and sign the books, because then they get like a nice little sticker on the front that says autographed. It then gets preferential placement in the store. You can sell more books. So anyway, I was close to home in New York, and one Saturday morning walked into a bookstore, all proud, just when the book came out, and said, "Hi, I'm Nick, this is my book." "Oh, great, we'll go and round up the books and we'll sign them." And just as I was getting out my pen, the person behind the counter said, "I'm sorry to ask, Nick, but we really do need to see some ID." And I said, "Oh, why is that?" Said, "Oh, the amount of people who come in and pretend they're someone famous and sign the books is phenomenal, They said, "We've got this whole room full of people who've forged signatures of people who've written books." Saturday morning, didn't have my wallet on me, and I'm thinking, okay. My photo's on the back. That'll do it. So I sort of, this is me. And the young lady looked at the photo and she said, "Oh, thank goodness for Photoshop." The story there is that Doug is a great guy and he does a great job on Photoshop. But so it's pretty tough. So I said, well, Saturday morning, and so I signed my books and was on my way. These are 3 programs that I've designed. City New Recruits is unique because it's obviously got the name of a bank in it. And this bank has a large philanthropic arm, or it's not even an arm, it's a separate business. And City really believes globally in helping out organisations. They've got an interest in education. And a program like City New Recruits is built around philanthropy. And although I talked before and said, well, it's absolutely critical that programs are built around skills needs, until we actually solve this skills gap, there are people who slip through the cracks. And so a program like City New Recruits has a mentor like Greg Payne, and this program is about getting people re-engaged, people who drop out. So I think there is a role for philanthropy in skills, but I think that it really needs to be managed, and it certainly shouldn't be a way that the programs are built from the ground up. But the other 2 programs here, NISMAP and Siemens, we've talked about those programs, and these programs started talking about, with employers, with the CEOs, what is the skills need of your business? What's the skills need? And in the case of Nissan, it was very much, this organisation is a dealership model, or a franchise dealership model. And so it was very difficult, unlike, say, Mercedes-Benz, who might own their own dealerships, trying to get a group of businesses to agree on a pathway forward with Nissan was really challenging. So they have dealership meetings, and most of the dealership meetings are talking to Nissan's head office about how they're getting poor allocation of cars and all these other sort of problems, and how come I can't get all the fast cars in the nice colours, and you give them to your friends. But the common conversation around the room that every dealer could agree on is having trouble attracting and retaining employees. So we were given the job to go and talk to these dealers and say, well, what's your problem? And they tried everything from trying to pay workers, try and poach workers from the opposition. And that was not sustainable, and that was causing a lot of problems in the dealer network. The second thing they realised is that when they did try apprentices, the apprentices didn't have the skills that they needed. Nissan cars, like a lot of modern automotive cars and trucks, are driven by diagnostics, not grease and grime. And so the schools were actually sending apprentices to Nissan saying, oh, this guy's doing okay at school, but maybe he'd be better off in an automotive apprenticeship. And so they had troubles, and they'd really said, apprentices, just too hard work. So it actually took the role of an intermediary company to be able to say, look, we will take the employment risk. This is the program we're going to design. And it was built around these core elements. I wanted to talk about education a little bit further and the importance. And earlier in the week, I picked up a newspaper, and it was talking about school closures, or the challenges in and around restoring, either restoring education facilities or the cost of maintaining educational facilities, and the fact that class sizes are dropping, and that then places pressure on the system to say, well, maybe we should close some schools, and it's all about efficiencies and different things. This PTEC partnership model really came to be in 2011 when the IBM Corporation realised that it couldn't find people with the skills it needed. So it actually went and approached the City University of New York and some business groups in New York and said, well, this is the problem we're facing, and we feel that we don't have any input into the curriculum, and we just can't find people with the skills we need. So a school opened in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and the students remain in high school for an additional 2 years. Employers help craft the curriculum, and students graduate with Year 12 an associate's degree, and students are first in line for jobs. Now, the first thing that people say to me when they hear about this model is, well, isn't this corporatisation of education? Is this IBM training employees for IBM jobs? What happens if IBM decides to change their employment model again? What happens? What do we do about that? And the answer to that is that there's a lot of work being done to make sure that the corporate partners in the schools are working within the existing education system. So it's a way of attracting students to those schools, and the partnerships have really evolved. Now you'll see down the bottom there's a list of 5 or 6 companies that have subsequently got involved and sponsored schools. There's now 27 schools in 5 states on the East Coast since 2011, with over 100 employers involved. And the employers range from Fortune 500 companies, but also small to mid-sized businesses have formed consortia in these schools. And the first students are about to graduate. And so it's a model where students get to learn in a way that is really engaging, and particularly the schools where the PTEC models are working best are in the schools of high disadvantage, where particularly young people are just not showing up. So it's quite exciting if you are working at, you're at school and have access to a one-on-one mentor from Microsoft in web development, and you're able to talk to that person. It's real world. It really says to students, well, this is what it's all about. So that's a very exciting model. What possibly could Singapore have to do with Nova Scotia? Well, the climate for starters. Does anyone know the climate of Singapore? It's generally about 31 degrees every day, and it rains. You can set your watch. It's a bit like, somebody said, Nick, at 11:59 and 59 seconds, put your fingers in your ear in Nova Scotia, So anyway, right. So the temperature is constant, except for winter. It actually drops. It plummets, actually. It plummets by 4 degrees, 27 degrees. So they have a harsh winter in Singapore. Second thing about Singapore is that it's only a tiny slip of land. Does anyone know how big it is? It's only about 713 square kilometres. That's it. And it wasn't that big, by the way. It was only about 640, and there's just constant push to reclaim land, and a lot of it is actually garbage because there's nowhere to put a tip. So everything gets burnt, long story. Anyway, Singapore faced some significant economic challenges. Really, you can't, if you're on 700 square kilometres, you can't manufacture anything, you can't really grow anything, there's very little you can do. And Singapore had become a destination stopover. That's really what the city was known for. People would fly in, maybe stay a night, particularly for Australians. We'd all go there on the way to the mother country. That's a good place to stop. You get Singapore or Dubai. That was really the story of Singapore. Young Singaporeans, the first thing they wanted to do when they left high school was leave, go somewhere more exciting. It was seen, actually I'm just looking at my wife thinking you were actually born in Singapore. I didn't mention this to you before, but anyway. So my wife actually, Prue actually understands Singapore all too well. She spent about 3 or 4 years there when she was growing up, and knows the culture all too well. And the culture is, don't worry about it, basically it's all going to get fixed. So that was a conversation that went on for year after year after year. Meanwhile, the rest of Southeast Asia is booming, was going crazy, Vietnam and all these countries around it. And it wasn't until that country set about developing a plan, and said, this is where we need to take the economy, we need to broaden our industries, and we need to say, what can we do? And it wasn't until all the businesses came together, and it was actually a business chamber that started the conversation with the government there, that really said, we need to drive that conversation forward. So Singapore now is really a key port to that whole region. So transport and logistics are absolutely huge. So if you stay in Singapore, I don't know if anyone's seen, there's a hotel called Marina Bay Sands. Anyone seen that hotel? Very cool. It's like three towers, and it's got this incredible cantilevered swimming pool that kind of hangs off one end. I mean, it's an amazing building. So if you go up there at night and look out to the water, all you see are just lights of just ships coming in, and it's a real port into Asia. Singapore always had a very strong presence in gardening, and it was known as a garden city, and they really developed that and have now turned that into a real selling point, not only the botanical gardens, but also all sorts of conferencing, horticulture, sustainability. It's become a very big international conference destination. But where I was involved was in and around education. The Singaporean government, or the Workforce Development Agency, came up with this idea to set up some programs and sell them to their neighbours. And they've done very well at it. They're selling education programs to Malaysia and to all sorts of countries in and around the Southeast Asian region. And the only reason, and I've talked to ministers in their government and all sorts of people, and I say, when did this transformation take place? And it actually wasn't until the business community believed that they could do it. And it took rock solid support. It couldn't just be one group of business leaders, or it couldn't be a government-led initiative. And it kind of reminded me of something else I've seen around here in the last couple of days. And I'm proudly wearing the badge tonight, thank you. And I was really pleased to hear about this program, because I think it's a wonderful initiative, and even just down to the presentation, I mean, it's really cool. You get like your badge and Yes campaign, but it really is, talking about all the attributes that are going to make this city and this region great. Entrepreneurship, but people really have to believe that it can happen.